says we have total freedom and total responsibility for our actions. And I mean, more often than not, the kinds of people who have advocated these sorts of views are people who think we're a dualistic personality. But if folks could put away their phones, I'd appreciate it, unless you're following along online. So, but here we have Sartre, who's an atheist, who, far from adopting Descartes' view of the self, doesn't believe we have. Let's do this. Okay. So, there really is a point of view called secular humanism. And I once heard, back when I worked for a Christian radio station in the 70s, Jerry Falwell talking about a humanist manifesto. And I thought, come on, Jerry, there's no such thing. I mean, that was made to parallel the Communist Manifesto. And I didn't think much about it. That I attended a meeting of the American Philosophical Association. You get 5,000 philosophers in the same room from all over the country, and they have a whole huge conference room with book dealers. And sure enough, there's somebody selling the Humanist Manifesto. So there is one. But secular humanism basically takes its cue from the old Greek philosopher Protagoras, who said man, meaning man in the generic sense, man is the measure of all things. And he did not mean what somebody like Plato would mean, that we are capable of discovering all things. He meant that we make truth ourselves. And this essentially is where Sartre has gone. And this is one reaction, one type of reaction you got in the 20th century. Sartre is writing this in the late 1940s, shortly after World War II. And so he's got some World War II illustrations in his writing. As I said, he worked for the French underground, publishing anti-Nazi pamphlets. Probably would have been, executed if he was shot, or at least thrown in prison. So, executed if he was caught. So, Sartre is one of the main founders of the point of view called existentialism. But we saw at the end of the empiricism PowerPoint that basically Hume thinks that we don't have a self. Actually, I don't know if I did Hume. At any rate, he thinks the only thing we can justify is the existence of our perceptions. I think we skipped over Hume, so that's okay. I won't put him on the final. And so essentially what you have here is the influence of David Hume almost 200 years after he wrote. You have Sartre saying, you know what, there is no universal human nature like Plato and Socrates thought. Remember, we looked at Plato's threefold view of the self. Essentially, Sartre's claim is that we, as human beings, determine what human nature is going to be. And so, humanism, man is the measure of all things, including what it is to be human. So unlike Descartes, unlike Socrates and Plato, there is no pre-existing human nature. We decide what human nature is going to be. Now, some people think that this is, you know, that there's a sort of arrogance about this philosophy, you know, pointing to ourselves and, hey, we as human beings are so great. We get to determine truth. It's not out there. Remember the old X-Files series, The Truth is Out There? Well, for somebody like Sartre, the truth is not out there. The truth is something we make up. If any of you did one of the Richard Rorty extra credit things, Richard Rorty is influenced by people like Sartre. For Rorty, he's also a humanist. So existentialism is a humanism. This, as I said, came out originally in a magazine. It was Sartre's attempt to explain the essentials of existentialism to the ordinary man or woman on the street, right? Because, I mean, Sartre's technical works like Being and Nothingness, you know, were close to 1,000 pages long. You know, the ordinary man on the street isn't going to understand it at all without a lot of background that ordinary people don't have. So that's one reason why this gets reprinted so much in intro text, that this is Sartre's attempt to explain existentialism to somebody who doesn't have a lot of philosophic background. And it works very well as a reading in introductory philosophy. So he's writing to respond to some of the criticisms about his view that it leads to despair and inaction because it bars the door to the solution of philosophical problems, emphasizes the negative and omits the positive side of the human nature, emphasizes things like anguish, dread. And this is a claim that he tries to distance himself from. I personally don't think he accomplishes that. There is a view in morality called subjectivism. And it's the view that many students have without even knowing it. And that's the view that basically morality is anybody's individual call. That moral principles are like goods in a supermarket aisle. That you walk down the aisle and you pick off the aisle the moral principles that suit you. And so we're going to look some at Sartre's ethics then along the way. But remember, we're studying this in the context of a unit on free will and determinism. So Sartre's position is libertarianism, which is basically the view that we are utterly free to make our choices. There's a discussion also at the end of the PowerPoint, and maybe we'll go over that if I finish this part today, where he discusses the basics of libertarianism. So there are people in a Judeo-Christian tradition who call themselves existentialists, and even to a certain extent today, maybe not as much as in Sartre's day. They try to reconcile existentialist themes like human freedom, living an authentic life, with religious belief. These are not usually very conservative believers. They're usually people who believe that we can kind of rewrite Scripture. At any rate, Sartre says, I mean, Kierkegaard is the prime 19th century example of this sort of thing is the forerunner of religious existentialism. He was a Dutch philosopher in the 19th century, and while he wasn't technically an existentialist, he was one of the precursors to this view. But Sartre agrees with Nietzsche that God is dead, and that the best way for him, from his perspective, to be an existentialist is to be an atheistic existentialist. Now, what Nietzsche meant by saying God is dead is not that the God of, say, the Bible and church tradition was once alive and very well, thank you very much, but somehow passed away. I mean, God is eternal, as we saw. No, what he means is there never was a God, and to say God is dead is to say that basically we as sophisticated 20th and 20th century persons can get along just as well without God as a crutch, without thinking there is a God. So he's trying to give us a way to formulate a philosophic worldview where God does not enter into the picture. So again, he agrees with Nietzsche that God is dead, and by that he means God is irrelevant to us today and unnecessary. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with Sartre. I'm just asking you, as we have with all these philosophers, to try to understand him. Right? I feel like my job as a philosophy professor, because we're giving you a balanced course and treating a number of different views, is to try to metaphorically give these philosophers their day in court. That is, to try to make their own position as believable as maybe they would try to do if they themselves were standing in front of you. To, we saw this with Berkeley, to try to make it, them sound believable. So, but what do religious existentialism and atheistic existentialism have in common? Well, it's the number one principle on which existentialism is based, which is that existence precedes essence. Now you say, oh, okay, well, I understand now the basis of existentialism. No, obviously we need to explain. What does he mean by this? And you'll see what he means is something entirely different from the Judeo-Christian view of things that an Aquinas would have held, something different from what Plato and Aristotle held, that things have essential natures that define what they are. For Sartre, especially in the case of human beings, that is not the case. So, existence comes before or precedes essence. What does he mean? Well, Sartre says, consider the other point of view from my own, the point of view where God is in the world. Well, and we saw Paley arguing this, right? That we are essentially created beings by God, same with Aquinas, according to God's plan and design. So if you look at the right-hand side, if God exists, God would create humans, so they would be made by a supernatural craftsman or artisan, made according to God's conception of human nature, what human beings should be. Even Augustine, while he kept Plato's forms, he essentially put them in God's mind, not out there in some ethereal intellectual realm like Plato had them. We would be made by God to serve a divine purpose, right? Basically, both Aquinas and Aristotle and Plato thought that we human beings have a purpose. Aristotle says it's to be reasoning beings. Now, Aquinas added to that one step further. Aquinas said, as reasoning beings, we have this natural instinct to want to know where we came from. What's the cause of our existence? Who's the first cause of all things? Well, he says God's the first cause of all things. And so, for Aquinas, our essential nature is not just to be reasoning beings, but to use our intellectual abilities to come to know God better. That's our real essence. Now, what Aquinas says here, and you'll see this parallel with the design argument, is if we are made in God's essence, he says, take a paper knife. Now, one of my students years ago said they read something where Sartre, when he talks about a paper knife, means just what we call a letter opener. Maybe he did. I haven't thought this worth spending, an hour or two researching it. But I think in terms of this kind of paper cutter, right, it's got the handle, there's a blade here, and you use it to chop up or cut paper, and hopefully not cut your finger off while you're right. But whether it means this or a letter opener, Sartre's point is the same. He says, if God were in the picture, our situation as human beings would be much like the situation of a made item. For Paley, that would be something like a watch. For Hume, it would be a house or a ship. Our situation would be like the paper knife. We would be made by a human craftsperson or artisan and made according to plans. I mean, you don't just, throw something, a created product like this into existence, right? You design it, and then you build prototypes and all that, right? So it would be made according to a preconceived plan of what the essential nature of the paper knife would be, made by a definite manufacturing procedure, made to serve a definite purpose, right? This is to chop up paper, right? So what is the whole bottom line of this? So I have it up the top. If something like a paper knife, its essence is determined before it exists, right? The plan, the essential nature of the paper knife is thought up before it exists. And if God were in the picture, our essential nature as human beings would be thought up by God before the first human being ever existed. So you could say, both for human beings and for manufactured things like a paper knife or a watch, essence would precede existence. In other words, the essence, the essential nature of a thing would be determined before the first human being as a God-created being, or before the first paper knife ever existed, or the first watch. But now Sartre says, that's not my view of the world. I'm an atheistic existentialist. So he says, as an atheist, he says, I don't agree with philosophers who put God in the background but maintain there's an essential human nature. Like Kant. in other words, there are some secular philosophers who still think that there are essential natures to things, even if God is not around. Sartre says, and I deny that things, especially that human beings, he says, for human beings, there is no pre-existing human nature. So, in other words, somebody like de Holbach says there is a pre-existing human nature. We're material beings, and as material beings, we have no free choice. You know, somebody like Descartes says, I'm essentially a non-material thinking thing. So this is what he means by existence precedes essence. In other words, if God is taken out of the picture, he says, there's no pre-existing human nature anywhere. There's no God to form a conception of it. And he doesn't believe that something like Plato's forms that would define human nature are there, right? And so for him to say existence precedes essence is to say human beings first exist, and then they, as human beings, define their essence. And a good example of this is, I mean, if you're talking about science fiction, there's a line at the beginning of Blade Runner where Harrison Ford, this was a movie made before Star Wars, talks about what he calls replicants, cybernetic organisms, combination of biological and robot, right? And he says we didn't consider them to be human beings. And they weren't allowed to come back to the planet Earth. And there was a death sentence if they did. And he said it was my job to go out and do these people in if they broke the rules. And he says this was not called killing. This was called retirement of a replicant. Is a cybernetic organism a human being? Could a robot ever be a human being? Well, Richard Rorty, who also is an existentialist and what he calls an anti-essentialist. In other words, he thinks there's no essential human nature. What Rorty says is the way that question will be answered is by whether or not we as human beings decide to let them into the club. It's not going to be because of some truth about cybernetic organisms that we will discover later. Of course, now there are no such thing. They're science fiction, but who knows? Okay. So in other words, this is part of this view that there is no pre-existing human nature, and whether or not we would allow cybernetic organisms to be human beings along with us depends on a human decision and how are we going to define human being. So humans first exist, then he says we define our nature. Now, I know you're saying, well, I thought we were talking about this in the context of a discussion about free will. Yeah, so here's where free will and free choice comes into play. It is by making our free choices that we determine who we're and what we're going to be. Sartre's quote here, and these may be pages I think they are pages in an older edition of your book, probably the one that I had up in my office. And if somebody still has that out, you might want to return that at some point. the copy of Solomon. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. So he thinks that we determine what human being is to mean for ourselves. We decide what the essential nature of a human being is, not, it's not there ready-made for us. Again, that's that robot. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. So, how do we do this, and how does freedom come into play? Some of you want to go to the nursing program. Some of you are planning on going to teaching or public administration. I saw a sign in the elevator where the business school is now developing a sports management program. In other words, you project into the future what and who you want to be. You know, I at one time projected into the future, you know, that I would be a philosophy professor, right? And then, so we have a concept, right, of what we want to be. And then, along the way, we make choices that are consistent with bringing that concept to realization. So, if you say, well, you know, in order to get in the nursing program, I need to get my gen ed requirements out of the way. One way I can do that is by taking a philosophy course, so I'll sign up for a philosophy course, right? So your decision now to be in this course was determined not by atoms and molecules in your past banging around, for Sartre, right? But by something in the future. So for Sartre, this subjective feeling that we are free is accurate. Whereas for somebody like the Holbach, it's an illusion. And think about it. He talks about, I guess it was Charlemagne who built Constantinople, about him projecting into the future what it would be and then making those decisions to build the city. There's a big apartment house that was built on what has been an empty lot since my parents moved into that home in the mid-1950s. Now there's a big apartment house there. I can't believe how big a building they got on that lot. At any rate, the building didn't just get there without a plan. Somebody projected, you know, made an architect draw up detailed plans, and then they brought it into fruition. But think about it. When we were talking about causal determinism, we were talking about causes in the past, right? The causes C1 through C to the N in our past, determining who and what we're going to do now, right? Whether it's A or B. For Sartre, what determines who we're going to be is not our causal past, but something we project into the future. And we make our choices now, whether to do A or B, not as they're conditioned by our causal past, but by something in the future. So Sartre says, where are the atoms and molecules banging around there? in my concept that I want to be a nurse, or I want to be a teacher, I want to be, you know, go to grad school in philosophy, I want to be a public administrator. He says, it's nothing in our causal past that determines our decisions, but something, the plan we have in our future that we want to act in accordance with. So he says our choices then aren't conditioned by anything in our causal past. They're entirely free. We freely determine our own essence because existence precedes essence. We first exist as individuals and then determine our essence. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a nurse. I'm going to be an administrator. Now, he says because it is we making free choices who determine our essence, we're responsible for those choices. And he says also, when we choose a particular course of action, this is where he tries to give some universal sense to universal values and ethics and elsewhere. When I make a choice, I also inherently say this choice is a good choice for the rest of humanity. Frankly, I don't think he can pull that off. Somebody like Immanuel Kant can say, I know I'm acting according to a universal principle if I can both do something and also wish that everybody else in the same situation be morally required to do what I'm doing. He says, for immoral principles, that doesn't work. I can make myself an exception, you know, and get something by lying, but that doesn't mean that I'd want everybody to do the same thing. So Sartre emphasizes personal responsibility, and he says this puts the weight of who I am, what I'm going to make of myself, and what we as humans collectively are going to make of ourselves on us. And he says, we're not comfortable with this. This causes us anguish. This is a response to the great responsibility that we have. In other words, if God isn't into the picture to have decided what human beings are, it's our job to do that, including to decide what moral principles we're going to live by. So realizing this responsibility gives us anguish. And he says, when we choose a course of action, we choose for everyone. We should ask, what would happen if everyone did this? Again, I think this is something that Kant can pull off because he does believe in universal moral values. I don't think Sartre can pull it off. And here's one reason why. Remember I said Sartre is writing this in the late 1940s. I think it's 46. I'm bad at dates. I'm historically challenged. It was hard for me taking Western Civ and to keep all those dates of wars and kings and queens and all that together, you know. He gives an example from World War II. Say you got a field sergeant, a military leader, has to decide whether or not, say, they're going to take out a machine gun nest that's in the way of their progress. Or are they just going to go around it? So if they decide to take it out, it's going to risk the lives of some of his soldiers. So a military leader may send a dozen men to their deaths in an attack he orders. And he feels anguish at this decision. So he says, well, what's the right thing to do? Should I eliminate this machine gun nest at the risk of, losing some men in doing so? or should we just go around it? What is the right thing to do? In this little illustration, I think you can see the point of view is subjectivism, that we determine moral right and wrong. It isn't there antecedent to us. He says he gives an option value by choosing it, not the other way around. So it isn't like there's a right choice before his choice. Whatever choice he makes is what makes it right. Now, for Sartre, then, there is no traditional morality. In fact, somebody who thinks that their actions are conditioned by a traditional morality is in mauvaise foi, bad faith. For Sartre, the only moral no-no is don't act in bad faith. But he also believes that acting in bad faith is doing something that denies your human freedom. So acting like we're determined, as somebody like de Holbach or Laplace thought we are, is also for Sartre acting in bad faith. And we'll see that, maybe not today. So we may try to escape our responsibility for making our own essence, make our own choices, and its resultant anguish by pretending we're not free. I'll say, no. We're in bad faith, he says, when we pretend that our decisions are determined by others or surrounding physical and social circumstances. In other words, if we claim that it is our environment or our genetics that has determined us to make the decision, like Clarence Darrow wanted to argue for Loeb and Leopold, Sartre would say we're in bad faith. We're denying the fact that we had the freedom to make the decision either way. We're trying to put the responsibility for that decision elsewhere. Also, we're in bad faith if we think our decision is conditioned by a pre-existing morality. In other words, suppose a couple gets pregnant and they're not making much money, and the issue of whether or not to have an abortion. And I'm not trying to step on any toes, but I'm just trying to illustrate something. It comes up in their discussion, but, you know, they're Roman Catholic and they think there's a pre-existing morality, and humans are humans from conception. They adopt a biological criterion for humanness along with the Catholic Church. So they say, look, a pre-existing morality says that abortion is out of the question. It's not an open choice for us. Well, for somebody like Sartre, they would be acting in bad faith because they're pretending that a pre-existing morality has forced their choice in the matter. He would say they are free to choose either way. You know, so Sartre, writing in what was then mainly a Catholic country, is an atheist, not a Catholic. So we're in bad faith when we pretend we're determined beings also, not free human beings. Existentialists and other continental philosophers in that European tradition love to multiply terminology. And he talks about the concept of being in itself and being for itself. And he says we as human beings are being for itself. The existence status of individual things in nature is être en soi, being in itself. Basically, what we'll pick this up next time. what Sartre is going to say is that, yeah, people like de Holbach are right about things in nature. They're being in itself, and they are determined by natural laws. But we as human beings have a different existence status. We are being for itself, and our being is not determined by physical laws. We are free to make our choices. So we'll look at that next time in connection with freedom. Excuse me.